Hello, and welcome back to History 122. In this segment, we're going to be looking at or getting a lecture on the state of the world, its various regions and populations, right at the time leading up to 1450, which will put us give us allow us basically to orient ourselves with regard to what was going on as we kick off this course. So we'll be in this next hour or so examining the experiences occurring at the origins of the modern world, the contests and developments surrounding the centralization, really, of authority and power. Specifically, we'll be looking at China, the rise of the Ming Dynasty, its expansionist agenda, also moving kind of westward across the Asian continent to the Islamic empires of the Ottomans and the Sassanids, and then continuing on into Europe and its experiences and kind of internal strife, you might say, with this 1-2 punch of the bubonic plague, as well as the Hundred Years' War that kind of coexisted and led to fundamental transformations within and across European kingdoms and societies. From there, we'll move across the Mediterranean into the African continent, examining briefly their kingdoms and establishing empires, and also the lucrative trade routes that were being set up to traverse the Saharan desert. Across the Atlantic, we'll wrap up things by looking briefly again at the Americas. This is largely and well handled in your readings of chapter 15 in your textbook for this week. But there are just a couple themes that I wanted to touch on before, like I said, wrapping things up with this kind of a overarching synopsis, really, of the world by the mid 15th century. So, looking at or starting with China and as well as Japan, it's important to understand that by the 14th century, the Mongols, which had come to dominate the Eurasian landmass, stretching from East Asia all the way across to what is today the Middle East primarily, and up as far north into the reaches of Ukraine, but also Russia as well, and the steppe lands there. The Mongols' expansive empire began to erode, and as a result, this allowed for more localized populations to regain their sense of autonomy and reestablish themselves. And this, one of the best examples of this, was the resurgence of the Ming Dynasty, the imperial order within China itself. China, under the Ming Dynasty, established in roughly about 1368, conquered Mongol territory that was contiguous to their established boundaries. You can see this with the documentary on Zheng He. It's actually Zheng He's family that was on the receiving end, you might say, of the expansionist invasion of the Ming Dynasty and Chinese power. The dynasty sought to exert, obviously, Chinese dominance throughout the Indian Ocean once it had managed to secure its holdings on the Chinese mainland. It established a hierarchy that it wished to convey basically to its neighbors, both regionally and globally as well. And this was grounded in the idea that the Chinese imperial order lay at the center of its sense of global orientation. This reflected Chinese philosophical foundations, and was really characteristic of all and nearly all civilizations, that there's a principle of legitimacy, often through divine means. You'll see this expressed in the study of the Ottomans and Omar's presentation that I've uploaded through the BBC Select production. But also at virtually any civilization that you study, you're going to see that kind of parallel from one civilization to another. Alongside this, Japan was also grappling with a series of internal conflicts. Contrary to China, Japanese society had managed to thwart Mongol invasion through acts of nature. In 1274 and 1281, you have the kamikaze, this divine wind in the form of hurricanes, sweep across the East China Sea and the Tsushima Strait to destroy on two separate occasions, Mongol fleets that had amassed and were preparing to invade the home islands of Japan. That kind of divine intervention in the eyes of the Japanese people allowed them to be spared from Mongol influence and occupation. However, the imperial order in Japan, separate in its identity from the imperial order in China, became subservient or subordinate to appointed warlords, the shogun, and the establishment of the shogunate within the Japanese socio-political order. So it was really these warlords, these provincial warlords, that held the actual power, political and military power, and were the ones that were driving and determining affairs of state within the Japanese mainland. These factions, the contests for power between shoguns, these provincial warlords, devolved into civil war that lasted nearly a century. So that by, I believe it's 1467, Japan was going to devolve into civil war that would last nearly a century. And it's as a result of that domestic instability and infighting that contributed really to its isolation. That there was no formal drive to expand either regionally or even globally within the Japanese hierarchy or powers that be at the time. Contests for power were so volatile within Chinese or Japanese society that just was not possible. Looking ahead, moving on to the Islamic empires, Ragay Omar, the host of that BBC Select documentary on the Ottomans, really gives an excellent overview of the Ottomans' origins and rise to power. Now, like the Chinese, the Ottomans and the Sassanids emerged from Mongol rule, as again Mongol influence began to retreat across the Eurasian continent. And as Omar aptly describes, this was the culminating event, the monumental event, the moment really when Mehmed II and the Ottoman Empire as a whole established themselves as a world power. The fall of Constantinople was a key turning point in several respects. You have in Omar's documentary the kind of well-balanced presentation of the competing points of view, right, between those that are kind of more pro-Ottoman leaning as far as how the Ottomans governed after the fall of Constantinople. That those that look favorably upon the Ottomans say that, well, they allowed for uh, freedom of expression of faith and freedom of religion to a limited degree, something that was not a guarantee at all by mid 15th century in the mid 15th century experience. Others on the other side saying, well, that there were still some very brutal, repressive kinds of practices held that the Ottomans upheld, which kind of undermine this idea of altruism and benevolence on the behalf of the Ottomans. That in that exchange, which is well articulated, I think, and gives you a sense of the different perspectives of historical study and approach. Really, at the heart of it, and I think one of the scholars comes to this conclusion, is that there's this interest in securing order and realizing that to make sure that there was some baseline of regimented order and a system in place that people would obey, that there needed to be an accommodation made on the behalf of the various cultures and religions over which the Ottomans governed. So I think it's that kind of approach that is really well done in that hour-long presentation. Another interesting side note is the fate of the Hagia Sophia, the massive sprawling kind of church within the confines of Constantinople, what is today Istanbul, and its transition from a Christian church to an Islamic mosque. What they don't really mention is that how relatively common really this was in particularly areas of the Eastern Mediterranean where you have an overlap of Christian and Islamic populations, where Christian churches would be simply retrofitted or refitted to become mosques. Hagia Sophia was not kind of an outlier in any way. It was actually more symbolic of a broader trend. What's also interesting about the study of these empires, in particular the Ottomans, which we give particular attention to, and its coexisting Sassafid Empire, is that these two rivals began to centered around the conflict, the broader conflict, more entrenched conflict between Sunni and Shia sects of Islam. So as the Mongols retreat, as these empires re-emerge or resurface, and these new powers come to the fore, they bring with them their orientations towards the Islamic faith. The Ottomans were followers of a Sunni Islam, that is to say that they had particular practices in following the faith, whereas Shia members believe in other practices of being devout to the original teachings of Islam. And these two communities, these two religious kind of sects or factions, were very could come into conflict rather easily at times in their long history. This bifurcation, this kind of duality between or within the Islamic faith itself, is one not very unique. I mean, you have the same effect, the same thing happening between Catholic Christians obeying the teachings of the Pope in Rome, and the Eastern Orthodox Christians turning toward the patriarch of the Christian church in Constantinople before its fall in 1453. And how, and I think Omar's documentary mentions this, where Constantinople is severely weakened by the sacking of that very city by Christian crusaders who were coming from the Italian peninsula on their way to crusading in the Holy Land, which they never did in the early 13th century. They simply looted Constantinople of its riches and then proceeded to make their way back to Italy. So, and those are two Christian communities, basically engaging in hostilities with one another. So another example would be, and we'll take a closer look at this next week, is the Protestant Reformation, in which this fracturing of faith into a wider variety and spectrum of sects, all considering themselves to be Christian, engage in rather horrific types of conflict and atrocities that we'll see are pretty well documented. In Europe, again, kind of turning our attention here, you have these two key developments taking place, and this is where we're going to focus most of our attention for this lecture. Two key events, one being the bubonic plague and the other being the 100 Years' War. These two kind of catastrophes that are going to affect the European continent, one universally and the other one between England and France, that are going to, these two main powers or main rivals at that period of time, that are going to set separate courses for each of them as we look ahead into the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries down the road. The bubonic plague dominated the latter half of the 14th and first half of the 15th centuries. Now, plagues were nothing new in the human experience or in the European experience. There was a plague that broke out in classical Greece. There was another plague that broke out in the streets of Constantinople in the 6th century AD. In both of these cases, there was a large amount of social unrest that quickly followed on the heels of these epidemics. What is different about the bubonic plague affecting the entire continent of Europe at this time in the 14th and 15th centuries is the sheer scope and scale of death and decay that occurred. It's estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died, which is unprecedented in the annals of much of human history. And this happened extremely quickly because the transmission rates of this disease and the time between first symptoms and resulting death was so short, which we'll get into in just a moment. Ironically, the arrival of this plague in Europe was also a sign of advancement. That this plague was not simply a European matter. It was the result actually of increased interaction with other societies, and the consequence, you might say, of growing commerce between and trade with distant populations, and kind of the daisy chaining that was beginning to take place between Europe, the Middle East, populations in the Indian Ocean, and China as well. The Black Death actually originated in Central Asia, and it spread both east and west, so that it affected populations in China early on, before it made its first arrival in Europe. It is thought to have come from bacteria-laden fleas that were transported on the literal backs of black rats that would transit ships making their way through the Indian Ocean on their way to and from and around the Eurasia continent. So it's the bacteria itself that is the plague, or is the manifestation of the plague. The fleas fed on the blood of rats, livestock, and human beings, and the disease, the bacteria, would be transmitted in this way. As far as symptoms are concerned, the disease in humans affects or infects the lymph nodes, which are concentrated mainly in the groin, armpits, and the neck of individuals. And it breaks down the capillaries, which causes bruising and swelling on victims. So this is basically where the capillaries are the extremely fragile, very delicate structures in the human blood system, circulation system, where the membranes are so thin that individual blood cells can make their way from the bloodstream into muscles and tissue in order to provide nutrients and oxygen and so on and so forth for us to remain alive. So when the blood vessels begin to break down, they begin to rupture because the bacteria begins to collect in those junctures, in those capillaries. The tissue ruptures, blood begins to flow with bleed internally, and therefore you have the internal bleeding taking place, which is what the bruising is demonstrating, or a direct effect of. Other symptoms would include vomiting, typically the vomiting of blood, high fever, coughing, as well as severe aches and pains. These latter symptoms are basically a result of the body beginning to decay and break down while the victim is still alive. And these are all natural symptoms, primarily ways for the human body, to alleviate itself of this foreign kind of contaminant and bacteria. Now, over time, because we're talking about bacteria, the plague mutated so that it could be transmitted by air. That is to say, it could live outside the human body for a limited period of time. So it went from being a bloodborne disease to that now being mutating into being an airborne disease, taking on aspects of kind of like similar to that of pneumonia. Now, it is this airborne variant that was lethal over 90% of the time. So not only is it more easily transmissible or transmittable, but also it's more lethal in its effect. The original strain, the bloodborne version, was lethal only about 30 to 35% of the time. Death was usually excruciating. It usually occurred within 4 to 7 days of a victim's first showing symptoms. And those that lived, and there were those that were able to live through an infection, they would often be racked with pain for the rest of their lives. They would have these, in some cases, hideous looking scars marking their traumas with this disease. That's a result of basically in some instances, in some records, they describe how the sick, the bedridden, would jump out of bed as their bodies began to, the skin began to rip from the inside out. When the skin could no longer hold back the pooling of blood, it would just simply rip open in these festering wounds. So it was pretty heinous as far as diseases are concerned. The disease, the plague, first appeared in Europe in 1348 in islands and in major port cities of the Mediterranean region. So places like southern France, the Italian peninsula were hard hit initially. Within the 6 months of first signs of infection among the general population, the disease had spread throughout the entirety of the Italian peninsula. And from there, it moved inland rather rapidly. There's a couple reasons for this. First and foremost, there were trade routes that had networked basically all of Europe together and its major commercial centers. So the movement of people was quite effective and efficient. Also, Europe at the time was overpopulated, so that people were moving, they were in close contact with one another, and once you develop a kind of airborne type of disease, transmission rates skyrocketed, and this plague quickly grew out of control. By 1351, so that's just 3 years or so after first cases emerged within the continent, bubonic plague had run throughout England, the German principalities in Central Europe, and also some Russian cities as well. Now, part of this is due to the fact that European social standards were, kind of subpar, maybe in some respects. There was a poor standard of hygiene. Transmission rates were aided by the fact that the poorest members, the poorest segments of European society, were often housed under the same roof as livestock. So especially in rural areas of Europe, when it was a bloodborne disease and these fleas were hopping from victim to victim, the transmission of the disease was aided by that kind of general practice. It may not seem so outlandish. Today people can be quite close to their pets. Some historians argue that the plague had more limited effects and access in the cultural practices in places like the Islamic culture, where the population usually bathed more frequently. For one example, it's more common to bathe hands, face, and feet before prayer, which was in the Islamic faith practiced 5 times a day. So in that context, the body and key appendages are being bathed much more regularly, and therefore kind of being cleansed more regularly. Also, referring back to Omar's presentation of the Ottoman Empire, there's a segment that talks about the baths that were being constructed throughout the empire. So it's a society, a culture that was more grounded in those types of hygiene habits, essentially. So therefore, because of that, historians would argue, and some do, that basically that helped to mitigate the spread of the disease in those populations. Also, exposure to disease often builds immunities. So these populations to outside of Europe, primarily that had been grappling with bubonic plague for some time, they had experienced it for years prior to its arrival in Europe, and so therefore, their immune systems were kind of more adjusted to it.